A dying man, 8 feet tall, lying in a hospital bed in 1903. The doctors lean in close. They expect him to ask for morphine or perhaps whisper a final prayer. Instead, he says something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. He tells them the truth about why men like him existed, why they suffered, and why there would never be another like him again. His name was Angus McKascal. He wasn't just tall, he was proportionally perfect, stronger than any man alive, and according to every physician who examined him, he should never have existed at all. But here's what makes his story different from every other giant you've heard about. McKascal didn't end up in a circus because he was desperate. He ended up there because someone realized his body was worth more than gold, and the people who profited most from his suffering were the ones writing the history books. If this sounds like the kind of story they don't teach in schools, hit subscribe. Every week I dig into the economic forces behind the historical moments everyone thinks they understand. Now, let's talk about what really happened. McKascal was born in 1825 on the Isle of Berneray in Scotland. Nothing about his birth suggested anything unusual. Normal weight, normal size, normal family. His father was a fisherman who worked 18-hour days pulling nets from water so cold it numbed your hands in minutes. His mother kept a small garden where potatoes and turnips grew in soil that barely supported life. They were poor, like everyone else on that wind-beaten rock in the Atlantic, where survival meant accepting that hunger was normal and comfort was a luxury reserved for mainlanders. When Angus was 6, the family made the crossing to Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. They were part of the Highland Clearances wave, though that term sanitizes what actually happened. The clearances weren't migration. They were forced displacement wrapped in economic language to make it sound like policy instead of violence. Landlords wanted sheep, not people. Sheep generated wool, wool generated profit, and profit justified eviction. Families like the McKascals weren't given a choice. They were forced out, shipped across the ocean in conditions that killed 1 in 5 passengers, and told to make it work in a place where winter lasted 8 months and the soil was harder than the land they left behind. And for a while, Angus did. By the time he was 14, he stood 6 feet tall. By 16, he was 7 feet. By 20, he had reached his full height of 7 feet 9 inches and weighed 425 pounds. But here's what the romanticized versions always leave out. He wasn't gangly. He wasn't awkward. His proportions were perfect. Physicians who measured him noted that his body maintained the exact proportions of an average man, just scaled up. His hands were proportional to his arms. His torso was proportional to his legs. There was no disproportion, no skeletal irregularity, nothing that suggested disease or disorder. His strength wasn't just impressive, it was physically impossible by the standards of human biology. He could lift a 2,800-pound ship's anchor to chest height. He could carry full-grown oxen across his shoulders without visible strain. He once lifted a horse over a 4-foot fence because a farmer bet him he couldn't. Witnesses described him picking up barrels of salted fish, each weighing over 300 pounds, and tossing them into carts like they were made of paper. In one documented incident, he lifted the rear axle of a fully loaded wagon to help a teamster replace a broken wheel. The wagon, the cargo, and the axle combined weighed an estimated 2,500 pounds. Doctors who examined him later couldn't explain it. No pituitary disorder, no skeletal deformities, no hormonal imbalance they could identify. His organs were proportional to his size. His bone density was normal. His musculature showed no signs of the gigantism that plagued other men of unusual height. He was just built different, and that difference made him valuable in ways that would define the rest of his life. Here's where the story shifts. In 1849, a man named P.T. Barnum sent scouts through Nova Scotia looking for oddities. Barnum didn't deal in entertainment in any traditional sense. He dealt in spectacle, and spectacle meant bodies. Bodies that could be displayed, measured, photographed, and monetized. His American Museum in New York had become the most profitable exhibition space in North America by turning human difference into a commodity. Dwarfs, conjoined twins, people with rare conditions, Anyone whose body deviated from normal could be converted into revenue. When the scouts found McKascal, they didn't see a man. They saw inventory. They saw a body that could generate ticket sales in every major city from Halifax to San Francisco. They approached him with an offer. Tour with the circus, perform feats of strength, meet crowds, shake hands with dignitaries, and get paid more money than he'd ever see fishing on Cape Breton. The offer was specific, $50 per week, which in 1849 was more than most skilled labourers made in 2 months. McKascal agreed, not because he loved attention, not because he wanted fame. He agreed because the alternative was dying poor in a place that had no use for him except as free labour in someone else's fishing operation. The deal was simple. He'd be billed as the world's tallest true giant, the term true being critical to the marketing. Barnum's world was full of men on stilts, platform shoes, and exaggerated claims. There were performers billed at 8 feet who were actually 6'2" with clever staging. But McKascal was the real thing. Verifiable, measurable, authentic. And that authenticity made him worth exponentially more than any fabricated act. For the next 14 years, McKascal toured with circuses across North America and Europe. He performed in front of Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle in 1853. He lifted carriages in Paris while crowds gathered 3 deep to watch. He bent iron bars in New York theatres, where admission cost $1, more than a day's wage for factory workers. Crowds paid to see him, and Barnum's operation took 70% of gross receipts. McKascal got his $50 per week regardless of whether the show made $100 or $10,000. But here's the part that gets overlooked. McKascal wasn't just a performer, he was a product, and like any product, his value was tied to scarcity, spectacle, and the story being sold. The story being sold was this: Angus McKascal, the gentle giant, the noble Scotsman, the man blessed by God with size and strength. Newspapers called him the strongest man who ever lived. They described him as kind, soft-spoken, and generous with children. And by most accounts that was true. But the narrative wasn't built around his character. It was built around his marketability. Kind giants sold tickets to families. Violent giants attracted police attention and scared away respectable audiences. And the whole time, McKascal's body was breaking down. Carrying 425 pounds of muscle and bone puts immense stress on joints, on circulation, on the heart. Modern physicians estimate that his heart had to pump 40% more blood per minute than an average man's just to keep his extremities oxygenated. By his mid-30s, he was experiencing chronic pain in his knees, ankles, and lower back. His breathing became laboured after performances. He developed circulation problems in his hands and feet. Doctors told him to stop performing, to rest, to reduce the strain. He couldn't. The contract didn't allow it, and even if it did, he had no other way to make money. His size, the thing that made him valuable on stage, also made him unemployable in any other field. No fishing boat could accommodate him. No factory had workstations built for someone nearly 8 feet tall. The circus owned him, not through legal chains, but through economic ones. In 1863, McKascal retired. He returned to Cape Breton and opened a general store in Englishtown. He lived quietly, rarely speaking about his years in the circus. When people asked, he'd deflect. He didn't want to be remembered as a spectacle. He wanted to be remembered as a man, but his body wouldn't let him forget. The years of performance had destroyed his joints. He walked with a cane. He couldn't lift anything heavier than a sack of flour. The same strength that once amazed crowds was gone, and what replaced it was pain. By 1863, just 2 years after retiring, McKascal could barely stand. His heart was failing. His kidneys were struggling. Physicians who examined him noted that his organs, while proportional to his size, were under immense strain. His heart had to pump blood through a body that was never supposed to exist. His lungs had to oxygenate tissue that required more oxygen than they could provide. He was dying, and everyone knew it. But here's where the story takes its strangest turn. In the final weeks of his life, McKascal began receiving visitors, not family, not friends, physicians, researchers, men from universities in Boston, Edinburgh, and London. They came with measuring tools, photographic equipment, and contracts. They wanted to study him. They wanted measurements, photographs, and permissions. Specifically, they wanted permission to dissect his body after death. This wasn't unusual for the time. Medical schools paid for cadavers, and unusual cadavers commanded premium prices. A normal body might fetch $10. A giant's body could bring 500 or more. Giants, in particular, were valuable to anatomists studying bone growth, organ development, and the limits of human biology. Their skeletons revealed secrets about growth plates, bone density, and structural mechanics that couldn't be learned from average specimens. But what made McKascal different was this: he refused every offer. No matter how much money was attached, no matter how prestigious the institution, he turned them down. Harvard offered $300. The Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh offered $500. One private collector offered $1,000 to McKascal's family, payable immediately, for the rights to his remains. McKascal refused them all. And when the physicians pressed him, asking why he'd deny his family much-needed money, asking why he'd waste an opportunity to contribute to medical science, he gave them an answer that confused everyone in the room. He said, "I don't want to be remembered as the thing they built." The physicians didn't understand. Built? Built by whom? One doctor, a man named Thomas Gilpin, recorded the conversation in his journal. He asked McKascal to clarify. McKascal's response was rambling, disjointed, and according to Gilpin, deeply unsettling. He talked about the clearances, about how landlords decided some people were worth more as exports than residents. He talked about how circuses didn't find giants, they created markets for them. And then he said something that Gilpin wrote down word for word. They didn't want strong men. They wanted proof that strength could be owned. Gilpin didn't know what to make of it. He assumed McKascal was delirious, his mind failing along with his body, but other doctors who visited in those final days reported similar statements. McKascal kept returning to the idea that his body wasn't his own, that it had been claimed, purchased, and displayed. And now, even in death, people wanted to own it. On August 8, 1863, Angus McKascal died. He was 38 years old. Cause of death was listed as heart failure, but really, it was systemic collapse. His body, magnificent as it was, couldn't sustain itself. He was buried in English Town, Nova Scotia, in a custom-built coffin that required 6 men to carry. No autopsy was performed, no dissection took place. His family honoured his wishes, and the physicians who had hoped to study him left empty-handed. But the story doesn't end there, because what McKascal understood, and what the doctors didn't, was that his value wasn't in his bones. It was in the system that made bones valuable. The Highland clearances weren't just about land. They were about deciding which bodies had worth. Circuses weren't just about entertainment. They were about monetizing deviation. And medicine wasn't just about knowledge. It was about ownership. McKascal's deathbed confession wasn't delirium. It was clarity. He saw the through line that connected landlords, circus owners, and physicians. They all operated on the same principle. Bodies are assets, and assets exist to be exploited. His size made him extraordinary, but it was the system around him that made him profitable. And the moment he stopped being profitable, the system had no use for him, except as a specimen. Here's what historians miss when they romanticize giants like McKascal. They focus on the spectacle and ignore the economy. But the economy is the story. Every giant who toured with Barnum, every so-called medical curiosity, every person displayed in dime museums and travelling shows, they weren't volunteers pursuing careers. They were products of a market that valued human difference only when it could be sold. And the moment that difference stopped generating revenue, those people disappeared from public consciousness. Not metaphorically, literally. They died young, were buried quietly, and erased from history except as footnotes in medical journals or circus ledgers. The economics were clear. A giant like McKascal could generate thousands in monthly ticket revenue. Barnum's share from McKascal's tours likely exceeded $50,000 over 14 years. McKascal himself earned roughly $30,000 total, most spent on custom clothing, medical care, and supporting his family. The value extraction was the business model. Bodies were assets, exploited until worthless, then discarded or preserved as specimens. McKascal was different because he refused to let the system have the last word. He wouldn't let them dissect him. He wouldn't let them display his bones in glass cases. And in doing so, he made a final statement about ownership that the physicians couldn't pass. His body had been rented, displayed, and broken down over 14 years. But in death, it was his, not theirs. There's a museum in Englishtown now. It has photographs of McKascal, letters he wrote, artifacts from his general store. But no bones, no skeleton, no medical specimen preserved in formaldehyde. Just the memory of a man who stood 8 feet tall and understood something most people never do. Value is assigned, not inherent, and the people who assign it are rarely the ones who benefit from it. So what did McKascal tell the doctor on his deathbed? He told him that strength isn't power. That being extraordinary doesn't mean being free. And that the difference between a man and a product is nothing more than who gets to decide what happens to the body when it stops working. That's the lesson they didn't write in the history books. And it's the reason McKascal's story matters more now than it did in 1903. If you want more stories like this, where the economic truth rewrites the history you thought you knew, click the video on screen right now. I break down the real cost of the California gold rush and why the people who got richest never touched a shovel.